Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Data to Action, How to Use New Searchable Data Profiles to Improve Practice and Policy for Children and Youth Experiencing Homelessness. My name is Erin Patterson. I'm Director of Education Initiatives at SchoolHouse Connection, and in just a moment, I'll introduce our co-presenters. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. This webinar will last 1 hour today, and all attendees' audio has been muted. But we do encourage you to submit any questions through the Q&A box that you see in your toolbar in Zoom. We are recording today's session, and you will receive a follow-up email after the session, which will include this recording, PowerPoint, and any other resources. We'll also archive the webinar on our Archives Webinars page at schoolhouseconnection.org. For those of you not familiar with SchoolHouse or Poverty Solutions, we're glad that you joined us today. SchoolHouse Connection is a national nonprofit advocacy organization committed to overcoming homelessness through education. You can learn more at our website, schoolhouseconnection.org, and we encourage you to sign up for our e-newsletter as well. Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan is a university-wide presidential initiative that partners with communities and policymakers to find new ways to prevent and alleviate poverty through action-based research. And you can see their website there, poverty.umich.edu. During our time today, we'll start with an overview and demonstration of the data profiles, followed by broad trends and takeaways. We'll talk about how to use the data profiles to raise awareness and inform practice, and how to use the data profiles to educate policymakers. And then, as promised, we'll carve out some time at the end for your questions. And again, please do submit those through the Q&A box throughout the presentation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Duffield at SchoolHouse Connection.
Thanks very much, Erin. So I'll just give a little bit of an overview before a demonstration of the profiles that Jen will provide. So the data that is presented to you with the data profiles is largely data from the U.S. Department of Education for the 2020-21 school year, which is the most recent national data that we have. It also includes data from the Office of Head Start. So those are the two main data sources. What we're excited about is that with the university, with Poverty Solution and Jen's great work, it's now disaggregated and you can search for it national, state, county, school district, and congressional district, and really use these data profiles to help understand the prevalence and impact of homelessness in your own community, your own state. So these can be useful for looking at under-identification of students who are homeless, the disparate impacts of homelessness on children and youth, the disparities in terms of who's experiencing homelessness, and the distribution of funding. Also can be a very useful tool for raising awareness broadly in communities and among policymakers. And we're excited about updates that are planned for fall 2023, which I will ask Jen to speak about shortly. And I'm actually now going to turn it over to Jen, who'll give a basic demonstration of the profiles.
Thanks so much, Barbara. So while I am sharing my screen really quickly, I will just sort of add to what Barbara was saying about future data profiles. We do have a plan to update these with future years of data, including expanding some of the indicators that we have. So we'd love feedback on how you're using this, what's worked really well, if you're having challenges with anything about the website, if there's data that you're really wishing we had. All of that feedback is great because this is something that we're planning to continue to do on into the future. So when you open up this data profile, what you'll see at the top is that there are 4 tabs. The first tab is really an overview of this site. And what it provides is a number of different resources. If you scroll all the way towards the bottom, they can answer some very basic questions that often come up when we're talking about child and family and youth homelessness. So the first are just a few definitional elements, why this is critical to pay attention to, where these data come from. If you're thinking about wanting to talk in your community about the impact of COVID-19 on this data and more broadly, if you want resources related to that, there's a link there. More information on when future data will be available. Thinking about how to talk about in your community, how this data is different from U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development data on homelessness, and again, how to just talk about that in your community. All of these different resources are here for you at the first page or the first tab of this site. So just make sure to scroll down all the way to the bottom. The next thing that you'll see here is that we've tried to create this database so that all of the different levels for which data is available can be found in one place. So the first profile that we have is just the national data. And this can be a really important tool for you to be able to just sort of compare some of your community's outcomes or your community's numbers too. You'll see that it has the overall number of children identified as experiencing homelessness. When you hover over any given number, you'll see a pop-up. This pop-up has additional information for each of the different numbers and indicators. In this case, we're seeing both the number of school-age children who are identified as homeless, as well as the total number of children who are enrolled in traditional or public charter schools. So likewise, you have the percent of children who are experiencing homelessness. And then we also additionally have the estimate of children and youth 0 to 6 who are experiencing homelessness, as well as information on the percent of those children who are identified and enrolled in early education and Head Start. And that is going to be an indicator that we're hoping to expand on in the future. We also have information here about the overall annual funding, as well as the additional funding that was provided through ARPA. And then here you can look at the impact that that additional funding had on the number of LEAs actually receiving direct McKinney-Vento support dollars for programs to improve services and identification. So that went up from 19.5 with the annual allocations that are typically received, 19.5% of LEAs nationally, up to 53.5% of school districts receiving supports. So that can give you a sense of just how much impact that additional funding had. Additional indicators that are here as well on the national site, and these same indicators actually exist on the state tab that I'll show you in just a second. But we see chronic absenteeism rates for all students, as well as students experiencing homelessness. And then we also have graduation rates for students experiencing homelessness, economically disadvantaged students, and all students. So these can be just really important metrics to look at in terms of identifying what gaps exist, what are educational outcomes that should be paying attention to, that you know that your schools and your communities are paying attention to. And you can use these national data as points of comparison for your communities, whatever that level you're looking at it as, whether it's at the LEA level, the state level, or the congressional or county level. A couple of other important indicators that I just want to highlight here. We also have information on the percent of students experiencing homelessness who also are parts of other programs, important programs in schools. So here, for example, you can see that 20.3% of students experiencing homelessness in the United States were also enrolled in a special education program. And that's a higher rate than all students. So we have this comparison number in the pop-up, so you can see that information to just get a sense of the equitability of how things are split in terms of programs, whether there's greater need. And that's also an interesting thing to think about, because I can tell you that these percents vary a lot by state as well as by school district. So that, becomes an interesting question in terms of thinking about how your community is approaching access to an enrollment in special education services. Another really important number down here is how many youth are experiencing homelessness on their own. We see that nationally it's 8.7% of homeless students nationally are youth on their own. So that's also a really important thing to be thinking about. How in your community are youth being reached? How are we reaching those youth nationally? What programs are available? And also I want to make sure to highlight English language learners and migrant students in the US. So we think about these different intersections, because students are experiencing many different things. And we want to make sure that we're capturing how these different programs intersect so that we can support students experiencing homelessness in the best way possible. Over here, we also have information about where students were staying when they were first identified as homeless. This gives you a sense of, what type of access there are to shelters, whether or not there is a large hotel, motel population or youth and families staying in hotel motels and paying out of pocket, or potentially that could be a shelter location as well, depending on your community. And also how many youth are in shelter or staying doubled up. As we know, the majority of youth and children are staying in these doubled up situations. But again, this varies greatly by community. And so these are some indicators to look at for whatever geography you're interested in. And again, to compare back to the national data and also to the state. If you scroll all the way down, we have the same information available on the state side again, but we have information on the race and ethnicity of students who are experiencing homelessness, as well as on the number of unaccompanied homeless youth FAFSA determinations, which is a really important metric to thinking about how much access and how are we helping youth experiencing homelessness who are unaccompanied on their own access college. One important thing you can see, and this is I've seen this fairly consistently in most communities that I've looked at, and that's that this number has actually dropped slightly from the prior year. So that's something that we should all be thinking about more. At the very top here, there is the option to print any one of these pages. If you hit print, you'll get an image of the page. And this is another great way to just sort of save your comparisons as you're developing your ideas or thinking about how to use this data locally. The second tab is state level data. All of the same indicators that I showed you on the national data are here at the state level. The one difference that you'll really see is that right here, there is a pull down menu so that you can select a state. And when you do select state, or in this case, I select the District of Columbia, we also have information for the District of Columbia, as well as the Indian Bureau of Education and Puerto Rico. You will see that these numbers all here change to be relevant to this geography. So you can see, for example, in the District of Columbia, from the annual funding with ARPA that went or the annual funding for McKinney-Vento, 13.2% of schools, school districts in District of Columbia were receiving McKinney-Vento support funds, and that went up to 68% with the ARPA, our HYC funding. So that gives you a sense of just how you can use that. One thing I will point out, there is a note here that says that not all data were available for the Bureau of Indian Education and Puerto Rico. And just so you know what that might look like. In cases where data is not available, you will see some blanks appear. So as much of the data as we have, we list, but when there isn't data available, that will come up as a blank field. The last tab that I want to just show everyone really quickly before we go back to Barbara and talk a little bit more about some of the broad findings that we have from this data is the local tab. And this is really looking at congressional, county, and school district level data. So here you can see that the menus have expanded. So we have a state tab, a congressional district tab, a county tab, and select a school district. You can use this in a number of different ways. Probably the easiest way to do it would be to select your state first, because that will limit some of the other elements that are going to appear. So I'm not sure which state I actually just selected. Let's see what we selected here. We've selected Maine. Okay. I was meaning to select Michigan, so we'll do that for just a second. That's just because that's where we're located. So I figure that's a good point to start. But what you see when you select your state is that a map appears, and this map is the different geographies. It's at the school district level. And so the first thing that you can do if you're just interested in exploring what some of this data looks like in your state, you can just sort of scroll over these geographies and you'll see that a pop-up comes up. And it gives you some basic information about each school district that you scroll over, including, what the county is, the congressional district, state, as well as the number of children who are identified as homeless, the percent, and then the percent of children who are in poverty, and whether or not that school district is a recipient of an annual McKinney-Vento subgrant. So that just can give you, it's more of a useful tool for exploration as you're just thinking about where you want to look. It does not actually change the data down below. In order to change the data below, what you would do, so let's see, if we wanted to go to a school district, we can start to type in a school district. Let's select Kalamazoo Public Schools. And then what you see up here is that the map will change. You could, if you wanted to, hover over this and you'll see all of this pop-up information print up. That's still available. But then below, you'll see all the information down here change. So we now can see that there were 807 school-age children who are identified as experiencing homelessness in Kalamazoo. The total population of children was, just over 12,500 who are enrolled in traditional or public schools. That's about 6.4% of school-age children experiencing homelessness in this school district, in a district where about 20.8% of children are experiencing poverty. And then this here gives you a sense of how many school districts are receiving a McKinney-Vento subgrant. Now, because the Kalamazoo school district is a recipient of the subgrant, you see here that there is only one school district listed, and that school district has 31 public schools, again, serving 12,581 children. It is, and 0 of those schools were part of a charter district. So that is because we're, selecting one school district there. So that's how you'll see the data. And I'll show you that it changes a little bit if you have multiple school districts included. Again, down here, you can look at the chronic absenteeism data. There is, a very sharp difference, about 20 percentage points between all students and homeless students in terms of chronic absenteeism rates. That can be a very important thing to be thinking about for your school district if you are a liaison working with a specific district. Another thing that we can pull up right here is that it can show you for your district what percent of students experiencing homelessness are English language learners, have special education needs, are youth on their own. And again, when you're looking at these numbers, it's always important to ask yourself the question of, these are the numbers in terms of students who've been identified. And does this look right in terms of your experience? In terms of special education students, 19.5% of homeless students also being students with special education needs is fairly in line with the national data, which was around 20%. But in another community, it could be much lower. I've seen rates of like 11%, for example. That might lead you to question, is there a barrier that's preventing some of our students from actually accessing these services when they need them? So you can look at these numbers and they tell you what is right now in terms of what are the services that are being received by students and how they have been identified in our system. And then it's always important to go back and just sort of do a reality check for yourself of, does this data make sense? Does it match your experience on the ground? And over here, again, we can look at where students are staying. Again, the majority are in a doubled up situation. But again, this will change by community. And then the last indicator, we don't have graduation rates for the local data because the numbers were too small at some of the different levels. Too much data had to be redacted for privacy reasons. But we do have, and we also don't have the FAFSA numbers for the same reason, but we do have data on race and ethnicity. And one thing that is here that can help you get a sense of racial and ethnic disparities in terms of the experience of housing instability in your community is that when you hover over race and ethnicity, you'll be able to see the percent of students who are homeless by race, but then compared to all students. So in this case, 62.6% of students who experienced homelessness in Kalamazoo were Black. That's compared to 38.6% of all students in Kalamazoo who are Black. So you can see that there is this very large disparity with students who are Black experiencing much higher risk of experiencing homelessness or rates of homelessness in the community. Before I pass it over to Barbara, I'm going to show you just one other aspect of how this number right here changes when you have more than one school district. Oh, before I do that, actually, you can see over here that when you selected Kalamazoo School District, the Congressional District changed to match so that you now know that Kalamazoo is in Congressional District 6. And you can also see that that is the Congressional District here for Debbie Dingle. Okay, so we're going to just go back for 1 second to all schools. And we're just going to really briefly select a county. I'm going to go over here for, oops, I'll type in Washtenaw for a second. Oops. Okay, so Washtenaw County. And what I wanted to show you here is just that this number, which was 100%, now changes because there are 21 school districts in, or LEAs, that received funding out of 22 school district LEAs in all of Washtenaw County. So this gives you, these numbers will change here depending on how many school districts you're including. And then you can see the same information below. There are 94 schools. They're serving 43,000 students roughly, and 13 of those school districts, or 13 of those schools were a part of a charter district. Again, Washtenaw County apparently has multiple congressional districts. So right now, this here, instead of changing to just one number like we saw for Kalamazoo, says all. And if you click on it, you could see that Washtenaw County is partially in District 7 and partially in District 12. So we could, for example, select District 7, and then we get a slightly smaller geographic grouping. And every time you change the geography, what happens over here, this is, the coloring is based on the percent of students in these geographic areas or school districts who are living in poverty. And that percent ranking changes based on the school districts that are included. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to pass it back over to you, Barbara. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Jen. As many times and as many hours as I have spent on that site looking at the data profiles, I still learned about 3 new things from the demonstration. So I really appreciate that. We also wanted to share a couple of things in addition to the data profiles, broad trends from this data that you can use when assessing where you're at with your local school district or county or state, and also to raise awareness with community members as well as policymakers. So we produced 2 joint briefs, Seen and Served, How Dedicated Funding Supports the Identification of Students Who Are Homeless, which really looks at the correlation between some amount of dedicated federal funding for students experiencing homelessness and identification rates. And then the other one, which is sort of a fact sheet of current trends, challenges, and needs for students experiencing homelessness. So the next slide, just to look at some of these, we have sort of 4 broad takeaways from the data. And this is one that we come to again and again, which is just massive under-identification of students who are experiencing homelessness. This is not the first analysis of data to show this. Certainly the Center for Public Integrity did a research earlier this year that looked at under-identification. It's something that comes up in the U.S. Department of Education's monitoring of school districts and states consistently. And we also know when we look at the CDC, the data from the Centers for Disease Control, their Youth Risk Behavior Survey, that we also see under-identification. Looking just at the school district data, we know that 1/4 of all school districts in the nation reported no students experiencing homelessness. And this was collectively over 300,000 students. Of those districts that identified or reported no students experiencing homelessness, 92% received no dedicated homeless education funding. So it would make sense that a little bit of funding contributes to a lot of identification, but now we can actually put our arms around that in terms of this particular data. We also looked at a couple of other dynamics with respect to federal funding and under identification. One is for rural areas, who, if you look again, comparing students experiencing homelessness to all students in rural areas, actually enroll a disproportionate share of children and youth who are experiencing homelessness, but they also have the largest share of school districts that don't have dedicated homeless education funding. So we know from other studies that there's equal prevalence of homelessness in rural, suburban, and urban areas. This just shows too that the lack of funding there. And lastly, with that, we know that charter schools are also overrepresented among school districts reporting no children and youth experiencing homelessness, oftentimes not part of the regular training and professional development that's provided. And Jen, I see you got your screen on and you would like to offer some commentary on this piece.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one piece on the rural homelessness rates, and that's just that I think this data point is particularly important because of the fact that we know that schools and school districts often are one of the very few sources of access to resources. And so, seeing that both that there are these very high rates of homelessness, but also that school districts don't have dedicated funding in these areas is really an important thing to think about in our communities. How do we make sure that children who are experiencing homelessness are actually able to access these resources? And so I would, say, particularly if you are in an area where, you are serving rural districts and you see some of these areas where there's 0 students identified and the poverty rate is really high, that is a very important place to be looking at and think about, okay, there's probably under identification going on here. How do we improve identification and how do we get supports to these students who really are going without any supports?
Thanks, Jen. The next broad trend on the next slide, looking at, again, the data, are just to be able to talk about the impact of homelessness on outcomes and also the demographics of who's experiencing homelessness. So Jen highlighted in the various demonstrations, both at the state and at the local level, the much higher rate of chronic absence of students who are experiencing homelessness compared to all students, which actually double the rate of all students nationally, and was exacerbated by the pandemic. So that's something you can look at too in terms of talking about why pay attention to this issue. Why are we talking about students experiencing homelessness and how to serve them? If there's a large issue with chronic absence, it could well be that student homelessness is one of the drivers and may not yet be named or called out as one of the drivers of chronic absence. With respect to the graduation rates, again, Jen described that we don't yet have it in a way that we can share at the local level. We hope to be able to do that in future iterations, but even looking at, for example, the state level of graduation rates, it's not just homelessness compared to students who have stable homes. When we look at the impact of homelessness on graduation rates compared to other economically disadvantaged students who have stable homes, you see a 13-point difference. So homelessness has an impact on educational outcomes that's over and above poverty. Jen also highlighted the overrepresentation among students with disabilities, English learners, and students of color. So we really need to be talking about homelessness, not just as a civil rights issue, immigration issue, but one of equal access across these student groups as an intersectional issue. We don't have, as part of this particular database, but elsewhere on the Schoolhouse Connection website, information on the impact of homelessness on our youngest children in terms of their health and their development and getting them ready for school. And also we know for youth who are homeless and youth on their own, barriers to financial aid and college access and completion. So just again, a way to talk about the data and understand it in terms of why are we talking about this experience that many students have, and what is its actual impact on education. And Jen, I didn't know if you wanted to add any additional comments on that piece.
So the only thing that I would add there is just that, we do, while some of those briefs on early education are located on other areas of the Schoolhouse Connection site, we do have that data on access to programming and estimates of the number of children experiencing homelessness in that earlier age bracket, including, I don't know if I stayed over the hover box for long enough, but if you hover over the number of children who are experiencing homelessness in that early age bracket, you can also see the total number of children from 0 to 2, from 3 to 5, and then from 3 or from 0 to 5. So you can get a sense of the identification and participation in some of these really important early education programs. And I can tell you the numbers are low. And that's an important thing to be recognizing, that those numbers are so low that we couldn't highlight them at the community level in many cases. So that's another area that, there's really an opportunity to use this data to show people and to talk about why it's important that we think about housing instability at a young age and the developmental impacts it can have, and how we can and why we need to improve outreach.
Thank you. So next slide, again, looking at sort of the broader trends and the way to talk about this data is you're talking to community members, school board members, service provider organizations, policymakers, and that's really the reach of federal funding to identify and support students who are experiencing homelessness. So we know that half of all of elementary and secondary students are attending a school district that don't have dedicated funding. So right there, that puts them at disadvantage of even being identified as experiencing homelessness. And for those students who are identified as experiencing homelessness, we know that 42% are also in a district that didn't get any dedicated funding to meet their unique needs. So it's both the lack of funding that's correlated to under-identification, but then also the lack of funding to support the specific and unique needs. And again, as Jen highlighted earlier, at the annual funding level, that's less than 1 in 5 school districts that are getting a McKinney-Vento grant. And on the next slide, again, just to highlight a piece, Jen also talked about just the dramatic increase in the number of school districts who are now getting some level of dedicated funding through the American Rescue Plan Act, a great expansion of the number of districts. And we know that the Department of Education is doing an evaluation of the ARPHCY program, and we in our advocacy are very much advocating for this level of funding to continue. It is less than 2% of all K-12 federal education funding, and yet without it, there is not even basic access to education. So that is a bright spot in this, is that there are so many more school districts that are getting some level of support, even though it's one time. And on the last broad takeaway we wanted to talk about is really the impact of the pandemic. So I saw there was a question asking about trend data, and if we would be able to use this data in this profile to talk about trends. There is not in this iteration. We will have the 21-22 school year data. Department of Education will make that available sometime in July. And so we're hoping that by fall, we will be able to have it into the database or into the profile so that you would be able to see trends between 2021 and 21-22. But even so, many school districts know what their numbers are for that year already. The Department of Ed is a little bit of lag in the federal data collection and can certainly talk about this school year and can be able to talk about, for example, the fact that there were many students experiencing homelessness. There's a drop in enrollment in the 2021 school year that was 4 times greater than the drop in enrollment for all students. So definitely indication that the pandemic had a disproportionate impact on students experiencing homelessness being disengaged from education. Also, and even more of a drop over time. When we surveyed school district liaisons in the fall of 2020, the reason wasn't because homelessness decreased in the pandemic. The reason was because in virtual learning, it was hard, in some cases impossible, to identify students. Communication was lost. It was hard to keep track of families. Many families didn't send their kids to school. They were afraid for a number of reasons. So that's a significant impact that we're still seeing the consequences of today. And then just to point that one of the biggest areas of decline was for our younger students, the 3 to 5 year olds. And I think on the last slide, is that the last path? That's just one last slide about the impact of the pandemic and how to look at the data in terms of how was it then, how is it now, how do we want it to be in the future, is again a doubling of the chronic absence rate for students experiencing homelessness, a decline in the number of unaccompanied homeless youth getting their FAFSA determinations for financial aid by almost 10% compared to the prior year. And really the first year that the number of FAFSA determinations made by McKinney-Vento liaisons went down. And then very big concern for us in terms of that transition to post-secondary education is a big increase in the number of youth who were requesting a determination of homelessness to get financial aid, but did not actually receive it by the end of the application cycle. So again, showing that the challenges of actually getting the documentation and that determination of homeless status to go on in post-secondary. So we've got a lot of work to do. And next slide, I think we are now back to, before we turn to questions, we want to do 2 more demonstrations, one specifically about how you can use these data profiles to inform practice, for example, to assess under-identification, and then also to talk about how the data profiles can be used for advocacy and talking to policymakers. So I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Thank you, Barbara. And I'm just going to pull this up on my screen. All right. So I just need to actually have access. There we go. So what I wanted to walk us through right now is if we go to the local tab, for some people using this database, you'll want to just focus in on using it as a way of finding out what your local school data might be. And that is a really, really important way that this database can be used. You can, just use it as a quick stop to find out how many students there are, what % of students there are. I know that was a challenge that I talked to many liaisons about in Michigan for a while, that they knew the number, but not necessarily the %. So it was hard to compare across districts to see where resources were more needed or where there might be under identification taking place. And then you can also use the different outcomes for your school district. So that's a very important way to use this database. Another way that this database can be used, though, is to think about where it might be that under identification is taking place. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the map on the database is color-coded by the % of children who are living in poverty in that school district. And this data comes from the census. They have a data set where it has the poverty rates for school districts. And so that's where we're taking this from. And you can very quickly sort of look over some of these different rates. So here we have, a Macon County. You can see that there's 38.5% of children 5 to 17 were living in poverty. 3.1% of children were identified as homeless. Over here, we have Greene County, where 40.7% of children age 5 to 17 were living in poverty, and 0 children were identified as homeless. So that would be, a place just really quickly that would jump out at me to say, this is something where we should look at identification practices. We should see what might be going on. So this is, a way that in your state, to start off with, you can pick any state and you can just sort of explore and see how these rates change. Are there areas where there is higher poverty, but lower identification? Again, another county here, Perry County, has 43% of children living in poverty and 13.3% of children experiencing homelessness. These are pretty dramatically different rates. So that these differences really suggest that there is under identification going on in some of the areas. If you have similarly high rates of poverty and the rate of homelessness is ranging from 0% to 13%. So that's just an example of one way that you can use this data to think about homelessness. Now we're going to sort of zoom in to talk a little bit about other advocacy tools or ways of thinking about this. So I'm going to, get this to move. Okay, so here we have the state of Connecticut. And, say, for example, that you're thinking about your congressional representative and you want to talk to them about housing instability and homelessness in the communities that they represent. Well, you can select your state and then go over, we'll say, Congressional Representative 3. And what you'll see is that we're going to zoom in on this specific area in Connecticut, of Congressional Representative 3. And you can get a nice sense of where poverty rates are higher in the community. And you can sort of look through some of these areas. Again, just thinking about what the data might be. And I think the pop-up is going a little bit slowly, but generally speaking, it would show up. But you've already seen that pop up, so you could use it in the same way. And then over here, you can think about also what counties does that representative work for. And so you can see here, there's Fairfax County, Middlesex County, New Haven County. So we could go and select further in. So we're looking at Congressional District 3 and New Haven County. And as you're down here with each of these different selections, these numbers will change. So this gives you the option to have data that is specific to different representatives. And this is important because your congressional representatives have, say over a certain kind of funding that's related to homelessness and housing instability for children. Your county, many of the programs go through counties, so you want to be able to have the county representation. And then, at the end of this, you also want to be able to think about the school district. So in this case here, I'm going to just see if this will pop up right now. So we have this district here is New Haven School District. So, we could go over here and zoom in just a little bit more and say that, New Haven School District is the school district with the highest rate of child poverty. And what we see here is, about 1.6% of school-age children are experiencing homelessness there. It does have a McKinney-Vento subgrant. Again, rates for chronic absenteeism are much higher. They're, about 27 percentage points higher for students experiencing homelessness. There is a very, very high intersection between English language learner needs and students experiencing homelessness, as well as students with special education needs. So there's really a need to be connecting these supports. And then a lot of children are youth on their own. 8.5% of students are youth on their own. And then you can see there's an interesting breakdown here in terms of access to shelter. So you can take this from the congressional district overall, and each time you could print up these sheets, and you can talk about what are areas where, that in that congressional district's representation that maybe, or in that congressional representatives area that maybe they should be thinking about, or thinking about why this data is important to them specifically. And so you could print up a profile for each of the school districts if you wanted in this congressional district. Another thing that I think is, just important to note is that this rate of homelessness seems overall in the district seems lower than you would expect. And overall in Connecticut, actually, this seems a bit lower. So one thing you could do in addition to thinking about internal to your state is to think about other areas that might be similar to your state in some way. So here, for example, we could look at Hartford City School Districts. There's a rate of poverty among children 5 to 17 that's about 30.6%. In this district, we see 1.3% of children were identified as experiencing homelessness. And now we're just going to go over to Massachusetts, which is just north. And if you come over here, and we're going to just take a quick look at Springfield, and we'll see that there's a slightly lower rate of poverty, but it's roughly the same, 29 versus 30. But the rate of students identified as experiencing homelessness is 5.1%. So this sort of brings this larger question of what might be going overall in Connecticut's system and in this district 3 that might be pulling down the rate of identification, or why children are not being identified as often when we do have areas that have similar poverty rates and where you would think that you would see more children experiencing homelessness. So that is one way that this tool can be used. Another, just to give one more example as well, and then I will pass it back to Barbara before we open up for questions. I'm just going to go over to Texas. And one thing I do want to note as this is changing, because as you'll see, if I go to Texas District 12, because as you select different criteria, what's available in the other boxes or pull down menus only becomes what the intersection is between those. So, you're not going to have every single county in Texas available anymore because we're looking at Congressional District 12. So you only have the counties for Congressional District 12 available, and only, again, the schools for Congressional District 12 are available here, which is nice because you can get a sense you're only selecting within that. But the important thing to remember is that you're going to want to return these menus back to all every time before you change something, because otherwise, like for example, if I picked Fort Worth ISD, but I wanted to be able to go to one of the other counties, my only option now is Tarrant County because I have Fort Worth ISD selected here. So you'd want to make sure to select that back to all. And then you would have Tarrant County, Weiss County, and Parker County available. So that's just sort of an important note when using the database. One other thing that I wanted to sort of point out here in terms of using this database as an advocacy tool is, in this Congressional District 12, we can look at the number of students experiencing homelessness, the rate of students experiencing homelessness, and the schools districts that received, the percent of school districts that received annual education funding. But one thing that really jumps out at me here is that 17% of students who are experiencing homelessness are youth on their own. So now, if this were my congressional district, or if I were speaking to my representative, this is something that I would bring to them and say, how are we meeting the needs of these students? We have a large number of youth who are experiencing homelessness on their own. We see the vast majority of students are, living doubled up. There are, roughly 1 in 5 are staying in shelter, which is more than many places. But, that would raise a question to me. Are any of those shelters youth shelters? Are there drop-in services that are available? So you can look at some of these other criteria here and start to raise some of these other questions. It also really jumps out at me that, only 12% of students experiencing homelessness in this congressional district are receiving special education services, compared to 20% of students experiencing homelessness nationally. So that could be another area where, you want to raise those questions and think about, why is this the case? Are we actually meeting the needs of students? Are the programs there to support children? And that can be sort of looked at by doing some comparisons between these different geographies, from the congressional level to the state level to the national level. And again, you could select down, say for example, you only wanted Parker County in Congressional District 12. There's still a number of school districts. As you can see, some of these are charters, some of them are ISDs. But you can scroll down and you can see how some of these numbers change. There are fewer English language learners proportionally, many fewer children, families in shelter, some, a lower, again, percent of youth on their own, slightly higher special education students. But looking at these different comparisons can help you to understand where some of the gaps are. And it also can help you to understand where things might be going right. So if you, see a district where the chronic absenteeism rate is, there isn't such a large gap, that's a great opportunity to think about, okay, let's find out what might be going on here, what's going right. Likewise, if there's a district where the identification looks really, really good and is really strong, why is that the case? What are they doing? So I think there are opportunities to really use this data and use it to speak to people at different levels, because people really care about the data that is most directly related to their personal job. And so being able to bring a congressional representative data that is specific to their district, being able to bring the county data that's specific to their county, and likewise the school district is really important. One last thing I realize that I want to show really quickly is just so that everybody recognizes for charter schools, when you select one, we have the data for charter schools. However, because they're not geographically located in the sense of being a geographic district, there is no map for them because they don't have a geographic boundary the same way that traditional public schools do. And that also means that there's not poverty data specifically for those charter school districts. Again, because that poverty data is based on the census, which is really using geography there. Another thing that you will see is when we've listed something like one student experiencing homelessness, that is actually inferred. We're giving a low estimate. The data is redacted under 3. And so, there is a student experiencing homelessness. We don't know if it's 1 or 2, but we chose the lower estimate in this case, just to be conservative. There. The other thing to really important is, and this is a note that's large here, but it says if the number of children identified as homeless is less than 30, percentages below are unreliable and should be interpreted with caution. So, for example, you cannot interpret a percent based on one student. So you could, the 37% of students chronically absent for all students is perfectly accurate. But, just thinking about those percentages and knowing that in some cases when the data is not available, you will see some of these blanks if the numbers are too small. And definitely if this number here is less than 30, you probably want to be looking at a larger geography to get a sense of what's going on in that community, because the data are not really very reliable. Barbara, I am going to stop there and pass it on to you unless you have a specific question that I haven't answered that you wanted me to touch on.
Nope, I think you got it all. Thank you. And once again, I picked up a couple additional pieces. So one last piece to say about advocacy before we open it up to questions. And that is, actually there's 2 things. One is when you are looking at for the US representative, the congressional district, the way, and Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, the way that NCES does this is it assigns a school district to a congressional district based on how much of that school district is actually physically in that congressional district. So I freaked out a little earlier and I emailed Jen and I was like, why is it? I know that X district definitely has a McKinney-Vento sub-grant and it's showing 0. And I know that these districts are in this congressional district. And so she explained that to me. So in that case, for example, you would just want to pull down the school districts and not maybe necessarily go to the congressional district. So one piece there. And then the other thing I would say too is when you're reaching out to US senators, the state tab is really what you want to pull down, because that has the comparison of the McKinney-Vento annual funding to the ARP funding. And then last thing on the next slide, just to let everyone know that there is a urgent opportunity to use these data profiles right now, which is that there is a bipartisan Dear Colleague letter that is circulating in the US House of Representatives. It closes on March 17th, which is Friday. So we are asking people to get in touch with their US Representative's office and ask them to sign on to this letter led by Congressman Davis, Congressman Bacon, and Congressman Panetta. Again, it's a bipartisan letter, which is a great thing to have in a divided Congress. You can click on the link there. So this is really a big push for this week. The other thing I'll mention is that April 1st to the 16th is congressional recess. This is when members will be back in their districts and is an excellent time to invite them to visit a site, to visit a community partner, to bring your printout of your congressional data profile with you when you have those visits to help educate about the needs. So I'll stop there in terms of, and then very last piece, you can join our advocacy network. We're happy to help set up meetings with you and congressional offices as well. And we'll turn it back over now to Erin, who will moderate our Q&A.
Thank you very much. There are tons of questions. So first I want to acknowledge couple of ideas that have come in. Thank you so much for suggestions about translating this into Spanish. I think that's a really great suggestion. A couple of suggestions about comparing to different data sets. Like it would be helpful, someone said, to have the chronic absence rate for economically disadvantaged as compared to students experiencing homelessness. We won't be able to get to all of your questions, and that pains me, but we'll put up our contact information in just a moment. I want to make sure we're getting to some of the bigger picture things and give Barbara and Jen a chance to respond to those. And given that we have 5 minutes left, I want to start with this question. The participant says there's clearly a link between identification and the overall percentage of children experiencing homelessness. Is there any data that would indicate how additional funding would paint a more accurate picture of how many are actually experiencing homelessness?
Jen, do you want to take that first?
I mean, I think that this is, I wish I had a better answer. I think that this is a big unknown. I think that we have the data to be able to say that there is definitely under-identification taking place. And we do have data to say that a lot of these school districts where there's 0 children being identified, which is a very clear indicator of under-identification, it's just very unlikely that there is no child in the entire school district in an entire year that experienced homelessness, that those districts, very few of them have any sort of funding. But we don't have the opposite, which is proof that additional funding, increases the identification rate. So,
but we probably will, though, with the ARPHCY. So one really important thing to know is that Department of Ed is tracking ARPHCY districts. Again, the huge increase, more than double the number of districts are now getting ARPHCY funds. So we will know probably for the 22-23 school year, we'll be able to say these districts never before got a McKinney-Vento subgrant. Now they had ARPHCY. What did it do in terms of the identification? So we don't have that now, but we certainly will be able to, I think, in the future, just by comparing those two pieces.
yeah, I think that's true.
I also know a couple people had really specific questions about usability and functionality. And so again, I'm going to encourage you, once we put our contact information up, feel free to reach out. I want to spend our last couple minutes on some other questions here. One is about the correlation between poverty rate and the rate of students experiencing homelessness. So Jen and Barbara, can you talk about that and its significance?
What I would say in terms of poverty rate and rate of experiencing homelessness is that you should see these two indicators moving in alignment in a general area, right? When you see these jumps between there's 30% community or poverty in a community here and 13% of children identified as homeless, and 30.1% poverty here and 0% are identified as homeless, that is a very clearly not, it does make sense. So, while I don't think that there is a exact standard we can use for the relationship between poverty and homelessness and housing instability, we can say that we know that they are related, and you should be seeing them move in similar directions in the larger community. So that's sort of the best advice that I think we can give at the moment. Barbara, do you want to add to that?
Nope, I think you said it perfectly.
We've had a couple questions on unaccompanied youth or youth on their own. And so I want to ask first, Barbara, the significance of using the language youth on their own for these profiles.
Yes, so we were very intentional with the wording for everything here, including actually calling them child and youth homelessness profiles and not student homelessness profiles, because there are many, I think it's easy to sort of put kids into a function, student, as opposed to children and youth. Unaccompanied is sometimes conflated with the status of unaccompanied alien minors or immigrant minors, the term for young people who are coming by themselves to the United States. And so unaccompanied in McKinney-Vento means not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. And so saying youth on their own gets to that status in a way that doesn't conflate it with immigration and other concerns.
Thank you for that. With 30 seconds left, I'm going to call it and remind you all that we have these resources. Barbara, do you want to say anything about these additional
I
Okay.
think they speak for themselves.
Agreed, they do for sure. And they are up on our website, and you will receive the links in these slides when you all get the follow-up information to this webinar via email. Here is our contact information. We'll leave this up for just another minute or so. Want to thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Jen, for your hard work on this and your presentation today. We hope you'll use these in your advocacy and practice efforts. Please reach out to us with any questions, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you.